Hola a todos y bienvenidos a la primera entrega de la sección de entrevistas de Whispr. Hoy os traemos una primera entrevista con Kenny Lee, cofundador de Manta Network y uno de los miembros más activos de la Universal Privacy Alliance. No hace falta decir que todo el equipo de Whispr estamos encantados con este arranque de 2023 y agradecer a la UPA, a Kenny y a todo el equipo de Manta Network su confianza en nosotros y su disponibilidad para hacer posible esta entrevista. Con él trataremos temas como la privacidad, los objetivos de la alianza, los problemas de regulación o la llegada de las CBDC, entre otros. Esperemos que disfrutéis de la entrevista tanto como nosotros. Vamos allá.
Great to hear that. We're gonna start by a set of questions about the UPA. Okay, and then we go to another round about Manta.
Sounds good.
Okay. Well, then let's get to it. How did the idea come about? So what led you to the decision of forming the Alliance?
Yeah, so the Alliance actually started off through like an informal conversation. I think that, we were on a panel discussing just general privacy with a few other privacy projects. And through that conversation, we realized that there's some common recurring themes around a lot of the goals and the initiatives, as well as the problems and barriers that we're facing that are essentially universal, right? Whether it comes to education, regulatory response, compliance, innovation, right? So these are all things that we're all working on separately to achieve the same goal. So individually, what we realized is that this would take the same amount of work and, a multiple of resources because we're each dedicating our own individual resources towards the same thing. And so instead of continuing down this path where each of us are individually ending up in the same area, we decided, why not build an initiative, a group, to focus on some of the common issues that we're all facing and pool together resources, pull together the minds from each of our teams to figure out how we can solve it together. Ultimately, that reduces the amount of time needed, that reduces the amount of resources needed, and it aligns with all of our interests. And so that's really how the UPA initially formed.
Okay, really, really interesting. Then the Alliance formation, has it had to do with what happened with Tornado Cash?
Oh, no. The Universal Privacy Alliance, the UPA, has been formed for quite some time now. We recently made our first public announcement in DevCon Bogota at the ZK House that we also hosted. When I say we, I mean Manta Network. But underneath, that public announcement was a lot of time, a lot of focus, getting the right projects in place, and making sure that we're all aligned on what our mission is. And so that definitely took a bit of time. I'd say probably by that time, we've already been working as a group on settling this and getting everything formed, probably for about a year prior.
Okay. Then what are the goals of the UPA in the short, medium, and long term? The main goals.
Yeah, so I think for the UPA, right, the main goal is to make sure that ultimately on the education and the regulatory side, that privacy on chain is fully understood. Right. I think that's the main problem right now, because people aren't really aware of the implications of a lack of privacy, especially, with the narrative currently. It's around, okay, if you need privacy, then you're probably doing something bad. Right. That's the current conversation topic when it comes to on-chain privacy. But obviously, you and I know, and a lot of other people are starting to become aware of the fact that on-chain privacy is way more than just about doing nefarious things, right? It's about your fundamental human rights. It's about your self-sovereignty. It's about protecting your data against, unauthorized viewership, whether it's through, insurance providers, employers, potential employers, government agencies, right? Enemies of state, et cetera, right? It's all about individual control of that access to information. And so I think like one of the goals, or one of the primary goals, is to make sure that the right audiences, whether it is regulators, whether it is, Web3 users, fully understand the discussion around the importance of on-chain privacy. And so you can dissect that goal into various different sort of actions that go more into like the short term and the medium term. And I think especially in the short term, right, like one of the low-hanging fruits that we need to do as the UPA is just build awareness. And I think that's really why, it's important to have conversations like this so that we can continue to start, educating people on privacy, but also letting people know that, this is what we're focused on, and start building not just the awareness side, but also interest around what we're doing, getting the community on the UPA, and start, building the message from there.
Okay. So now talking about the alliance, what influence does each project have on privacy? So since Menta's utility is to privatize another crypto assets, how do the participating projects complement each other? And what is Menta's mission in the alliance?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think that we all bring various technologies, various solutions, various methodologies to solving pieces of the on-chain privacy problem. For example, with NIM, they're specifically focusing on the piece where the data is transferred across the internet, the actual pipes, right, to get to, any sort of data on-chain. And so they're looking at, decentralizing as a mixed net. Whereas for us, we're specifically focused more on the on-chain privacy side. And so for us, we want to make sure that all the data that is preserved on-chain is fully privatized, right? So that the user is able to control exactly who has access to it. And then we have projects that are using trusted execution environments, for example, like Secret Network, and they are specifically on the data processing side. And so, yeah, I mean, ultimately, right, I think like the space around on-chain privacy and the innovation around on-chain privacy is new. And so there's a lot of opportunity for a lot of projects to innovate. And I think what we are doing really well with the UPA is that we're seeing projects like Manta Network, like NIM, like Secret Network coming together to tackle those various aspects of privacy. And together, I think we have a much more holistic understanding of the issues around privacy on-chain.
Great. And what's the most motivating purpose for you within the UPA?
I think the most motivating purpose for me in the UPA, apart from the goals, is the community. So, we have the top minds working on this, right, in the privacy side, and just being able to interact with them, being able to share knowledge with them, being able to coordinate and, plan things, whether it's events or initiatives or projects, alongside some of these people are just inspiring in general, right? And it's, I think the saying is true that like, it all depends on who you surround yourself with. And I think, surrounding myself with these types of minds has been really influential in my own thinking on like how we can innovate on the privacy side.
Great. This is so great. You have recently organized 2 events, one in Bogota and the other in Lisbon. How were they, and what impressions did you get from these events?
Oh, they were great. I think, so I was personally at the one in Bogota. This was the one that Edward Snowden was a keynote speaker at. And afterwards, right, we had a very positive reception from the audience. But I think also what was really valuable was that it was an opportunity for members of the UPA to get together in person and just brainstorm and do an entire session around, focusing on what our initiatives and goals are. And so I think after the actual presentation, we spent an additional probably 4 or 5 hours just talking and making sure that we have everything in place for next steps forward. So overall, right, like as an event to the public facing community, it was successful in the sense that it raised a lot of awareness and the sentiment was positive. And then in more of a private sense, right, like being able to get together in person and get things done was also extremely productive. So I think those events were definitely very good.
Great to see the project has this adoption on the public. So one of the objectives of the Alliance is to raise public awareness about privacy, as you said before. But what steps does the UPA plan to reach it?
Yeah, so a lot of the conversation around the UPA right now is focused around like regulatory and compliance. And so I think, a lot of these initiatives that we're working on are more so internal, just making sure that projects are aware of what's going on, right? Like the state of regulation, the state of compliance, what people are thinking about when it comes to on-chain privacy and where we could potentially have influence. And then on the more public-facing side, right, we're looking at key events that we should have a presence in, whether it's, crypto-related events or whether it's more industry or compliance-focused events.
Okay, great. We need that. We really need that. Well, at Whispr, we are very aware of the need for the privacy on Web3. Almost everyone gets to the crypto ecosystem is because of that, of the privacy. But we know many voices may suggest it could be used by criminals, as you said before. So have you talked about how to educate or guide people in regard to fight these ideas?
Sorry, say that last part again.
Yeah, do you think how to educate people to take out of their mind these ideas about the criminal uses, money laundering, and all this main conversation about the privacy on Web3 and blockchain?
Yeah, so I think that, these sort of ideas, it's not about taking it out of people's minds. I think it's important to recognize that, whatever sort of tools that you build, they can be used for nefarious purposes. And so with that in mind, right, like I do think like that should be something that people need to be aware of, and that can influence like how products are built, right, and how regulation is applied. But at the same time, right, like you need to be aware also that it's not just about nefarious purposes. Instead, nefarious purposes should take a very small amount of, the overall use case, right? Like you can think of this akin to cash, right? Like, yeah, people use cash for bad things, but I mean, I don't have any statistics on this, but I assume that most people use cash for good things or, well, neutral things. And it's the same with, credit card payments, wire transfers, blockchain, on-chain activities, et cetera, et cetera. And it's the same with privacy as well, right? And so it's just it's about finding that balance. And so I think like the importance here is making sure that we have a better balance. And so instead of, eliminating the idea from people's minds, it's more so about like re-centering people's understanding of the importance of privacy.
Yeah, right. We got it in with fiat money, and in the real world, it's coexisting with us since the beginning of the humanity, this concept. We also believe that governments and regulators should be the first to be interested in privacy. And they may offer some resistance to it. How do you plan to address the issue with them? And in case of not having their support, how do you think that the importance of how do you think the importance of privacy could be conveyed to users without them and without their approval?
Yeah, so I think that governments and regulators, at least from my understanding, is that they, of course, need to be conservative about how they approach these types of things, because you're not just trying to appease one person, you're trying to appease an entire population, you're trying to protect an entire population. And so, what are the policies that are in the best interest of the entire population? I think like that is that's definitely a reasonable train of thought. The one of the downfalls here is, the regulation, the best regulation can be made if you truly understand what you're regulating. And I think that is, something that still needs to, we as the UPA need to put in a little bit more effort to educate, policymakers on exactly what the implications of on-chain privacy really is. And so, why I guess my understanding of your question, and correct me if I'm wrong, is why would policymakers, why would governments be interested in on-chain privacy? And why should they be interested in on-chain privacy? And I think that governments are interested in on-chain privacy, but they have to do it in a way that is as fair as possible to their existing laws. And so one example of this is essentially protecting your own citizens, right? So I am a citizen of ABC Nation, and ABC Nation has a enemy of state who is 123 Nation, right? So like ABC and 123 are enemies. But on chain, without any sort of privacy protections, then every single piece of data that I write, every single smart contract that I interact with, every single NFT that I purchase, right? Like anyone I send money to, et cetera, the enemy of ABC can see that data and collect that data as a form of surveillance on its users, right? I mean, we already see this playing out in the Web2 space with TikTok. The United States is, banning or considering banning TikTok as an application because of its concern over China collecting data on US citizens. And so, especially with on-chain activity, when it's fully permissionless, right, then the idea of being able to control that access is entirely out the window. And so how can governments still protect their citizens and their best interests, right, in a Web3 manner? I think, on-chain privacy is definitely critical to that conversation. And so the question here is just more so how.
Yes, and education is key, as you said before. Changing from the government to the traditional businesses and companies, is there any plan in the Alliance so that traditional companies can adopt the privacy principles that it promotes?
Oh, yeah. I think that we are not, while we are specifically focused on, on-chain privacy at the moment, I think overall the initiative is more broadly focused on privacy and human rights in general, right? And so I think that a lot of the sort of ideas that we come up with and the members that we bring to the table will hopefully, right, we encourage companies, technology companies, hardware companies from various aspects, various industries to also participate.
Great. Now, with the creation of the UPA, we are aware that you've allocated part of the capital to create a support fund. So, what's the objective or idea with this fund? To support, promote, educate?
I think it's all of the above, right? I think ultimately the goal is to make sure that we're pushing for on-chain privacy in the right direction. And so in order to do so, right, I think at the beginning of the conversation I mentioned the formation of the UPA was all of us, we were all kind of dedicating the same amount of resources to achieve the same goals. And so now instead of, pushing those resources separately, we can pool them together. Ultimately, it lowers the cost of achieving those goals. And at the same time, right, like we can achieve it in a more efficient manner. So yeah, I mean, ultimately the fund is just to make sure that we can have the necessary resources on the monetary side to push forward with any sort of initiatives that we need to push forward with. Okay,
great to hear that. And now the great question for me. How do you think the arrival of CBDCs will affect the industry, and how do you think it could affect you? I'm really interested in your opinion about that.
Yeah, so I think that, the arrival of CBDCs, that's a pretty broad question, and a lot of the, I guess, thoughts about how it can affect the industry as well as myself is fairly speculative. I think that a lot of countries right now are researching and focusing on CBDCs specifically because it creates different economic incentives, because once your currency is fully digitized, it truly is about the data, right? So, the US dollar, for example, in its physical form, if I give you a dollar and then you give someone else a dollar and they continue to give someone else that same dollar over and over again, the central bank has no information about where that dollar is going, what it's being spent on, how it's being, distributed. And eventually, maybe the dollar goes back to a bank and it goes back to, and maybe there's some information there. I don't know. But if they actually track the serial numbers. But the point is that the dollar itself is not, there's no data around it, right? When you have a central bank digital currency, whether that digital currency is in a decentralized format or a fully centralized format, the point of it being digital allows for that sort of tracking, right? And so when you have individuals who hold a central bank digital currency directly in their, local devices, and they spend it at, I don't know, a grocery store, then that information about the grocery store can be, collected. And so again, this goes back to data. And it becomes an even more interesting thing, because it's no longer just about like being able to use US dollars in the United States. But let's say, for example, I want to use, I don't know, the euro, and I want you to conduct trade with me in euro, right? And you swap with me in euro and you start conducting trade with me in euro within the United States borders. Now, all of a sudden, right, like you've got, the EU kind of collecting data on activity in the US as well. And so I think ultimately it goes back to data collection, and, surveillance, I guess, for lack of a better term, for better or for worse. And so it does significantly impact the privacy of users all around the world, right? I think we look at countries that, enforce massive surveillance, and we say, oh, this is terrible, we shouldn't do that. But I think a lot of times people forget that this type of massive surveillance habit is an emerging trend that's global rather than specifically isolated to one or two particular nations. And it's pretty scary.
Yeah, really, really scary. Well, that's all about the questions about the UPA.
Y hasta aquí la entrevista sobre la UPA, una iniciativa sin duda interesante y necesaria cada vez más, sobre todo en los tiempos que vivimos, donde la privacidad online y on-chain son cada vez más vulnerables. Como habéis visto, la entrevista con Kenny no ha terminado, y en la próxima entrega hablaremos con él sobre Manta Network y el trabajo que están realizando para preservar la privacidad en blockchain. Esperamos que os haya gustado, y si es así, no olvidéis dejarnos vuestro like, suscribiros al canal de YouTube de Whispr, y nos vemos pronto por aquí. Un saludo.